So good morning, everybody. Goedemorgen, bon matin, wherever you are. Thanks for being that early already in the conf call. And probably it will not be our last call of the day, as we are used to work those days in this way of working. So thanks for being in the call. Several people are still joining in, so that's good. So let me start. So my name is Ludo Wijkman, speaking of the last breakfast session for this calendar year. So maybe to start with, let's talk a little bit about how we came to the subject. Leading as an architect is a topic that for a lot of us is on top of our mind, but also probably also influenced by the circumstances by many of the CXOs in the organizations that we are all working with. And actually, this is a program that has been developed with partners and under the leadership of xplus, and that we are delivering at several customers as we speak. So therefore, I'm very happy to have a lineup of several speakers that are going to present this morning. So I'm going to keep it short, and I'm going to talk a little bit of the household roles this morning. So you see them on the screen. So you can ask questions whenever you want via the chat box. I have Igor Korvers next to me, who is monitoring that. To keep the communication, I suggest we all stay muted. If you want to make a remark in the Q&A session, you can wave your hand and we will pick you up. During the presentation, we're going to have several polls as well, so keep an eye on that in the chat box. And then I would like to, I'm not going to introduce the speakers themselves, to introduce themselves quickly before their own presentation. And I would say enjoy the event. I'm coming back later on at the end to wrap up and maybe during the question. And the speaker we're going to have today is Henrik van Bruggen, who will talk about the increasing expectations for architects, leadership, and the challenges to meet those expectations. So I'm handing over now to Henrik. Henrik, I know you're in the call, so good morning.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me in your early morning session. Maybe let me start with introducing myself a little bit. Like mentioned, Henrik van Bruggen. I'm heading the enterprise architecture practice in ING. And that means that within ING, I'm responsible for architecture in the large, so for all the units, for infra to software, etc. I think that is enough for now as an introduction. You probably know to find me if you have more questions on that. The request was indeed, can you talk a little bit about what are the competencies and the role of the architect you see and how you see that in ING. And maybe as an introduction, and maybe it's good to go to the next slide. Can I do that myself? No, yeah. And the role of the architect practice in ING. I think first of all, it's important to add maybe a little bit of context what's going on in ING. ING being active in 42 countries nowadays. We are transforming more and more from a predominantly country by country oriented bank towards a more global bank. While we see that especially IT scales in a different way. And so IT you can build once and you can scale that for marginal cost towards all the countries. So there is no need to reinvent and redo all the development work on the IT side country by country. So that's the reason that we apply a modular architecture and an approach towards that to create a global bank based on a platform thinking. And not going to any further in the content, but more on the how. How do we accomplish that, and what is the practice of architecture from that perspective? And for that way, I want to explain a little bit how we see architecture. And we typically divide it in four themes or quadrants of activities, and whatever you like to call it. And you see them in the picture here. So we typically say that architecture focuses on 4 elements, being leading, planning, guiding, and verifying. And this decomposition we apply already for quite a while, for years now. And maybe to explain a little bit what we mean by it, by leading, we really say that is the part of architecture where architects help the board, the group, ING as such, in translating the business strategy vision into towards architecture. So depending on where we want to go as an organization, depending of course based on our legacy, because I think that's the job of the architect as well, bringing the legacy towards where the organization wants to be in the future. But depending on that strategy, trying to articulate how should architecture look like? What does it mean to become a more digital bank? What does it mean to become a more real-time bank? What does it mean to become a modular bank? In articulating that, decomposing that. So how would you look at the bank? How could you look at the bank to create a common vocabulary around that, and also to set a certain pace towards that. So that is really articulating the future of the bank. Planning is on the other side more a little bit the realization of that. So when you have a dot on the horizon, when you have your true north, so to say, how are you in the best way going to accomplish that? What is the order of things that should take place? And of course, that's always a balance between your ambition, creating business value on the short term, making sure that you get rid of your legacy and lifecycle issues at the same time. So what is the optimal balance, the optimal path towards that, taking into account all those considerations that we normally take care of as an architect? So that's planning. You can also call it road mapping. I think that's very close towards that as well. So road mapping, planning, and that is something you really have to bring towards the teams on the ground, because they have to have notions of that, but also the more senior management in our planning sessions, and what should be prioritized over what when it comes to budgeting and prioritization. The guiding quadrant, I think that is maybe for some of the people a little bit new, but guiding for us is really giving guidance towards the engineers on the floor. In the past, the way architects give guidance was more or less directive, in the sense that we applied solution architectures, very detailed, very worked out in detail. And it was also in a waterfall approach. And so when the design was there, that was the starting point for the engineers to start building. And nowadays, after 5-6 years, ING worldwide is fully applying an agile way of working, which means that there's far more responsibility at the teams themselves to combine that design work with also the engineering and development work. And that's done far more iterative in smaller cycles, but that means from an architecture perspective that you should set guidance more kind of swimming lanes. And so what are the swimming lanes that you have to stay in from a non-functional perspective, from a service demarcation perspective, from a security perspective. And so instead of creating solution designs, we more move towards cookbooks, we call them, and guidelines, and where we give guidance towards the team. When you create an application, when you create a solution or a microservice, this is the way to do it. Those are the things that you have to take care of. The last quadrant is the verifying one, and that is to make sure that what we design and what we create in the leading quadrant and the planning quadrant, and also in the guiding quadrant, is also really implemented by the teams. And so that is really checking if what is also designed, is that also what is implemented in reality. And of course, first of all, that's to also give your own feedback. So we get feedback, do we do the right things? And what we do, is it really creating value in the end phase? But of course, given that we are a bank, there's also a need that we, from a control perspective, can prove our regulators that we are in control also on the cycle of planning and change management. What you see in the middle, horizons, and so all the 4 quadrants you can do in different time frames. So horizon 3 is typically what we say 5 years and even longer ahead. So that's really the strategical element. The horizon 2 is 3 to 5 years, midterm planning. There you typically have to deal with life cycle kind of elements and things. And horizon 1 is the here and now towards 1 or 2 years. So that is really the projects and the programs and the strategic things you're working on a day-to-day basis. And so the 4 quadrants also have a kind of plotting into time. And you can imagine that, of course, leading is emphasizing far more the horizon 3, while the verifying is mainly on horizon 1, and the guiding as well. Having said that and explained that, so you now have a notion about the 4 quadrants and the 4 type of activities that we see that are very relevant for an architecture and to provide an architecture. I have a question towards you, if you allow me. And that question is, I think it will show up on the screen, and it's actually a poll. And the poll is, where do you today in your organization spend most of your time upon? I think you can, let me see in the chat, you can choose one. So which of the 4 quadrants do you spend today in your organization the most time upon? I would friendly ask you to provide some input on this and answer this question. Now, we see already a trend, I think, where you see that most of us spend most of the time indeed on the guiding part, and that equals a little bit solutioning, I would say. Good. Then I have a next question that I would ask you, and that is, when you consider impact to be your main driver and helping the organization to create value over time, where do you think that architecture should focus most upon the coming period? Is that also in the vote? Or no? Maybe we left that out. Do we have 2 questions or 1? Here it is, here it is. Yeah. Should you in the future spend most time on to have the highest impact? And take in there into consideration the whole context of the organization. So how can you really drive and make that the organization follow your thinking while creating the most value? Yeah. Now, you already see a slide. I think we should keep it short in this page. But you see a very interesting thing here that and I showed you here on the slide up front, and the outcome that we saw within the community of ING. But I think when you look at it, you see exactly the same pattern also here in the poll appearing. That in reality you see that most of the architects spend the majority, but really the vast majority of the time on the guiding elements. And then when you think about it, we all start to realize that probably we will have the biggest impact when we focus on the leading elements, in really translating the strategy of the ING, taking into account the legacy as well, where did we come from, and focus on that. The question is, of course, what is needed? What kind of competences do you need in order to be successful in leading? And how can you be more effective in leading? And I think there is one thing that I want to give you as a message, and that's in the next slide. And for me, the most relevant and important competence of an architect is really, and the picture already reveals it a little bit, but for me, it is really telling the story. So storytelling. And what I mean by that is, it's more or less also reflected in the picture, I think. The storytelling is really listening what's going on, listening into what's on the mind of the board, where do you want to go as an organization, taking that with you and start to build a story on top of that. So if you want to become more open in an open ecosystem and you want to enter other markets, what does that mean? What do you mean by that? And is that in a digital way? And try to create a story amongst that, saying, okay, but that means when we want to do that, we have to make sure that our processes become more STP. That means that probably we have to migrate from a more service-based towards an event-based architecture kind of patterns. So telling that kind of stories and building that on top of each other, I think that's extremely important. So listening very well to what is told by the business, asking smart questions. What do you mean by that? Can you explain? Please elaborate. Like you do at a campfire. Listen towards each other, look at each other, and start to build a response of that saying, okay, but when I listen carefully to you, I think that means from an architecture perspective and IT perspective that we have to invest in a new architecture or an event-driven architecture or a modular architecture, and try to explain what that means. So create that story while listening towards your board. I think for me, that is really one of the leading capabilities of an architect. And of course, that means that you need to understand the business, of course, but you also need to you have to analyze what was said. And of course, you need to have the guts in saying, when I listen, I think this is what we should do. And decisiveness is mentioned here. I think that's one of the things that architects lack in a lot of cases, and which also in a story, and when you are in a campfire setting, probably is not always that clear. And telling that you have 8 options is probably not what somebody wants to hear as an answer on I have an ambition. Probably somebody wants to hear, okay, when this is my ambition, it's far more valuable when you get a response saying, for my profession, that means that we have to do this and this and this, and this is how it relates towards your story. So I think listening, empathy skills I already mentioned, but for me, the thing to take away is please focus, and we have great results with that in ING in telling the story. And keep that story consistent, I would say, because then in your investment cycles, when there is a moment of a life cycle issue, or you have to go back to that same group of people, you say, remember, we were at the campfire. This was the story. Your dream is, I want to be that open ecosystem bank or whatever. I want to be that entering that new markets. We told you, this is what we have to do to make that happen. And this is how that relates to that. And so being consistent in your story, telling the story, repeating the story, I think the most important, beside, of course, knowledge and architectural practices, for me, by far the most important thing. And naturally, that's not where architects are the best in. They are a little bit more introvert than extrovert normally. They listen more than that they talk. I'm not sure that's not a wrong thing, but you have to contribute to make the story. And so telling the story, creating the story is as much as important, I would say. I think that is more or less what I wanted to convey in 15 minutes.
So then, thanks, Hendrik. Thanks a lot for your opening speech. I hand over to Jan.
Okay, thank you very much, Henrik. Do you hear me, everybody?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Okay, let's go. Thank you, Henrik. I really recognize changing expectations towards the role of being an enterprise architect. I want to emphasize in my story some of them. Maybe just to introduce myself, I'm working as an enterprise at xplus, working at different customers, and also we're involved in some of the assessments we're doing at our clients. And based on this experience, I want to bring you a short introduction in how we at xplus look at the skills of an enterprise architect. Maybe first to position it, this is typically a first step in a journey of growing architect, and it wants to look, where are we today as an individual? I have 3 parts, my story. First, I want to look what are the skills or competences we expect today from an enterprise architect. Second, I want to look how can we measure it with 5 different levels. And next, I want to give some examples in how to apply this. Okay, as an enterprise architect, we need a broad range of competences. First, some small step in, but how to define them. There's a lot of them, and we can make a lot of different lists, but some criteria are important. First, sounds trivial, but it's not. Each competence should be clear, understandable, and measurable. Clear means also clear for non-architects and also for people not from the organization, for example. Second, we don't want overlaps and a lot of dependencies between the competences, then it becomes really messing in measuring them. And third, as simple as possible, but not simpler. At xplus, based on different experience, of course, with some iterations, we identify 10 competences in 4 groups. I don't go to in detail, but I will just go to the different groups and I will just take some out of them. First group, core. What really makes you an architect? Combination of working at different time horizons, short to long to very long, in a broad business and or technology scope, supported by the right architectural tools and methods. This is what makes the job of an architect interesting, but also challenging. We need to be able to look far ahead in time and at the complete enterprise to see dependencies and opportunities, but at the same time, we need to be able to solve delivery and telling them or aiding them in taking the first step. So it's a big gap between short, long, small scope, large scope. Second group, how? The individual toolbox needed in our day-to-day architecture work. As an architect, we need to be able to divide the elephant with strong problem analysis skills, defining options, but any solution needs also decision. Otherwise, it will have no impact at all. To accomplish this, an architect typically needs to communicate, coordinate, collaborate with a lot of different people within an organization. Third group, interaction with others. How we deal with other people within an organization, making sure that we understand and address the concerns of our different stakeholders, and that we give back to the organization and make other people more efficient. For example, by coaching or knowledge sharing. And last group, engagement, how we as an architect are fitting into an environment. We require deep understanding of the organization we work for, how we as an architect need to fit in, and where can we make the difference. And of course, we need to be able to adapt ourselves when it's necessary. In summary, very quick, 10 competencies covering the broad range of being an architect. Next slide, please. Okay, but how can we measure it? One way to do it, it's we use the Dreyfus model. It's a very generic model in skill development. Important there is on each level, the way we learn, and also, of course, the way we can grow to the next level is totally different. It has 5 different levels. We can use it at each competence, but we can also use as kind of average across all competence. I just go quickly to the 5 different levels and mention some important learning aspects. First level, novice, as we start learning a new skill, we are only able to follow guidelines. Read the manual. Every skill learned starts by reading the instructions. So nothing special there. Knowledgeable, by experience, we are able to select the correct techniques depending on the context. For example, we can use different architectural tools, techniques, models, depending on the concrete architectural challenge. We probably still need some help, guidance in more complex situations, but we're becoming more and more independent. Third level, skilled. By learning and experience, we're becoming really independent. We make our own choices. And something different, we're becoming emotionally involved with the results. We act as a professional and want to achieve the best possible results. For example, we will make sure a decision is taken using formal ways, informal ways, by using our network within an organization. In summary, we just want to get things done. In this case, decided. Fourth level, master. We are gaining a broad range of strategies. Intuition starts to play. We don't think everything through, we just know it by heart. We have a drive for continuous learning and improvement. For example, we are now leading how the architectural practice is evolving with the need, for example, for a more agile way of working and thinking. We take ownership of the process and also of the outcome. And finally, fifth level, expert. We are very intuitive. We are not bound to any general rule and guidelines. We make our own story. We are strongly emotionally involved, highly committed. We are becoming a role model change agent within an organization and even beyond. Okay, but what level do we need? What level do we want? There's of course a difference between the expectations. For example, an enterprise architect or solution architect. An enterprise architect requires a broad horizon and scope, while of course with a lot of different stakeholders. As an individual architect, we probably have strengths, preferences, but attention point, there's also the need for some balance across the different competences. As a team or even organization, we probably need a mix. So how to use it? One step, typically example, is structuring the hiring selection assessment of architects. A general, rather difficult process. You can use it as an instrument to document it or to make it more objective by being able to compare different people. Second example, at a team level, use it in architecture practice development to increase maturity and also, as explained already, to have a more balanced set of competence within each team. If you look at the individual growth opportunities and instruments, maybe some attention points, as explained, the learning will become completely different as we move through different levels. First, become knowledgeable. So moving from novice to knowledgeable or even some parts of skills. It typically starts with some classical training. We learn the different techniques, so theory and applying it in practice. And the skill level increase with experience. There's probably already a need for more practice-oriented training. For example, storytelling techniques is difficult to learn from a book. We need to see it. The same with other competences, for example, how to model real complex architectures. If we want to move farther away, for example, skilled, so it's from knowledgeable to skilled or even master, we need even more concrete examples. We see a range of techniques and how it is applied in practice. For example, how to conduct a workshop to gain a common understanding or even reach a decision with a complex group of stakeholders. Typical approach is first receive some coaching, just see other people doing it and discuss how you would approach it. And even progress to help other people and provide coaching yourself. Why? Because it's accelerated learning. You get faster feedback on what works and what doesn't work. And finally, how to become master or even expert. As explained, this is about be involved, take responsibility. For example, take ownership of a change process within the architecture practice. This requires strong dedication and commitment. And at all levels, get the right assignment project exposure. We learn by doing from our successes and failures. So maybe to summarize, we identify 10 key competences for an enterprise architect, with for each competence 5 possible skill levels. It can be a starting point to identify a possible growth path. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. And I hand over immediately to Laurent. Laurent, good morning.
Thanks, Jan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Laurent Cornet. I'm Enterprise Architecture Lead at xplus. I'm currently working as a lead architect at BNP Paribas Fortis, and for the rest of my career, I'm on LinkedIn. I'd like to talk to you about what leading as an architect means practically for individuals. And I think you can approach this question by looking at what happens when, as a solution architect, you grow into a more senior role. Usually you start to realize that each solution is in fact a small organizational change. And for each of these change initiatives, there's of course a part that is a deliverable, a technical document, but you should start to think beyond deliverables. As an architect, you also have a responsibility to make sure that key people understand your solution, that the necessary knowledge is built within the organization so that a decision can be formed. So you need to shift focus away from deliverables and more towards the outcome. And we very often see architects struggle with that. It can take many forms, but it usually boils down to some level of frustration not to have the impact you should. And this is why we have put together a set of practical frameworks, thinking tools, and the goal is to draw the attention of architects on this shift in role, to orient their thinking in a structured way so that they can have a bigger impact. And we discussed 4 fundamental aspects of the role: how to manage your work, how to communicate, how to lead, and how to connect to the others. And I think during this session, you will get a poll in the chat, so pay attention. You may want to get your chat window open if not already done, and we'll review the result later. So let's start with how to manage the work. Next slide, please. Okay, so as an architect, well, you need to be able to organize yourself, to organize your own work. You need to be able to set objectives and manage a certain scope. You also need to be able to support large initiatives, such as a strategic study, for instance. And what we try to draw attention on is that you need to think with the end in mind when managing your work. You need to identify your overall goal, which is again not limited to the deliverable, but is more about aligning the teams and people around the decision. And then you need to split this goal into more manageable objectives that you can spread over time, using a backlog, for instance. And we use a few other frameworks to articulate those ideas. Some of them you can see on the right side of the slide. Next slide, please. So looking at the communication part, how do you align with people? As an architect, you are most of the time an agent of change. So you need to talk to a lot of different people. You need to talk to your stakeholders. You need to reach into the organization to establish trust with the decision takers, with their influencers, but also with other colleagues in various roles. And in that context, the question you need to ask yourself is, who do you need to really understand the solution that you propose? Because if, for instance, the decision takers don't understand the new concepts and what they imply, how could they possibly approve the proposed change? So you need to plan for communication, a bit of evangelization, and that too is part of the role of the architect. And this is one of the areas where we see room for growth in many architects. If you drive change, some people win, some people lose, and you need to clearly understand what they lose and then articulate what the solution brings in exchange for that. And to raise the awareness of architects, again, we use a few tools for that, and you can see some of the slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we understand what needs to be achieved, how to organize the work, who we need to align with. So how do you mobilize and direct an organization? But it starts with approaching the problem with the right strategy, not necessarily focused on the technical work, for instance. Take, for instance, a cloud migration initiative. The issue is not necessarily about how to connect via VPN to Azure or AWS. It needs to be done, but this is relatively easy. There are best practices for that. There are even cookbooks for that. In fact, focusing on that aspect alone may be considered a distraction from the real challenge, which is what needs to change in the organization to really leverage the cloud. What assumptions, what rules need to be challenged? What other projects need to be started? It's really about asking the tough question and focus the people's attention on the real issues. And since leadership is about mobilizing an organization, well, you need to have a pool of skilled and knowledgeable people you can tap into. And this is where the communities come into play. Next slide, please. So this part is actually about doing your homework beforehand. So you need to identify the people in the organization who can help you, who you can mobilize at the moment you need them. It's about really establishing links, but it's also about managing the knowledge at the organization level. Very important, often neglected, and this is why we again use a few well-chosen thinking tools to draw attention on the topic. Some of them are quite practical, such as the maturity model, for instance, that you see on screen. All right, quick look at the time. We're good. Looking at the poll, which I don't see. All right, I can see that a lot of you struggle with all of the above, and most of it is apparently aligned with others, which kind of confirms my suspicion. So there we are. I hope the short overview was clear enough in those 10 minutes. It's of course only an overview. And I'm not sure we have time for questions, maybe at the end of the session. So I will leave the word to Ludo.
Okay, thank you, Laurent. That was very clear. So let's move forward to the next speaker, which is Leo. Leo, you're in the call?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes. In the meantime, I need to go back to the slides, to your slides. Sorry for that. But you can start talking, Leo.
Okay. So I'm Leo Slegers. I'm an enterprise architect. I'm working in the central EA office of ING. The last years, I have been mainly working on building an agile EA practice and rolling that out to the rest of the company, to the entities in the company. Thank you, Ludo. I see my slides. Please can go to the next slide. Yeah. The problem I'll be focusing on is how to get the architects well embedded in the overall change process so that they can be the effective leaders that steer and guide the change. I will use ING as an example, but you can probably easily translate everything I say to your own situation. The change organization, and that's represented here by a tribe in orange at the left-hand side, it plans and executes the change. These days, leadership is more and more distributed, and we have DevOps teams that are self-organizing. They are empowered to take their own decisions, and we have delivery organizations such as tribes that have a very high degree of autonomy. On the other hand, architects, they are typically not in the delivery organization. They are experts. They have an impressive set of powerful tools. As an example, I showed the service catalog of ING, the architecture service catalog at ING at the right-hand side. Architects, they need to continuously grow their craftsmanship, and they have to work together and build a shared architecture knowledge base. And because of this, and also because, of course, they have to support the overarching strategy of the enterprise, it's usually preferable to have the architects organized in a center of expertise, as is the case in ING. But this creates a distance between the stakeholders and the architects. You hear that when stakeholders say architects are in their ivory tower, for instance, or when architects are complaining and saying, I'm not invited to the meetings of the stakeholders, or I don't have the mandate, and so on. So there is some distance. Let's assume that the architects possess all the required leadership skills, as explained by Henrik, Jan, and Laurent. How do they lead if they are not in the organization of the stakeholders? You cannot solve this just by putting some KPIs or by just training the architects. Next slide, please. The solution, as we know, it is not new. Peter Senge already popularized the term a learning organization in 1990. It represents what an ideal organizational environment is for learning. And a learning organization depends on mastery of 5 dimensions. And next to personal learning, we also see that there is team learning and building a shared vision. So learning as a team. And this is exactly the idea we want to pursue with the training we are currently developing at ING together with xplus. We need to bring the architects and the stakeholders together in one session so that they can build a shared vision and learn as a team, learn together what architects can do for the stakeholders. Just for before continuing, I would like to know how you do that in your enterprise. So Igor, could you launch the poll? So the question is that I have to you, when you do trainings for architects or on how architects is used in the company, do you do that primarily with the architects themselves, with the architects together with the IT stakeholders, or do you also involve business? So do you together do it for business, IT, and architects? How do you do that? Let's see. Yeah, answers start coming in. Yeah, it's well the trend. Well, I was not exactly expecting that the weight majority would be that we don't do it, but okay. What we see is that most of the companies they train primarily the architects. They also do architects together with IT, and they also I see they also do architects, IT, and business. So although we know for a long time that it is very beneficial to learn as a team because you have to work together, we do not do that always. And one of the reasons is it's not easy. Let me give an example. When we did the rollout of our new EA practice in the entities of ING over the last 2 years, we typically organized an engagement meeting, as we called it, in each entity, where we invited the architects together with the stakeholders, also business, and then we explained the architecture services. And then the stakeholders were listening very politely, but it was very clear also after the meeting that this explaining of architecture services is not sufficient to have them fully understand what the value is that architect might bring to them. And so when we were beginning of this year starting to discuss the concept of a new architecture training, we realized that we were still too much thinking from the architectural perspective, so inside out. And we then decided to radically change and to start from the stakeholder perspective. And we want to build this training, we will build it fully around the situations that resonate with the stakeholder. Next slide, please. As a first step, what we did was making a list of typical stakeholder situations where the involvement of an architect is beneficial. For instance, if you are a tribe lead and I'm preparing my tribe roadmap, what are the constraints I should take in consideration? Or for instance, what are the possible solutions that meet my objectives and how do I compare alternatives? How do I evaluate them and so on? At the top, what you see in blue, these are the architecture services that are used by the architect to address these situations. The stakeholder, of course, has to know that the architect has a toolbox to address the challenges, but he does not have to know the details of the services. I also want to as an aside, draw your attention, you see the dark orange block at the right. This is architectural decision management and also architecture debt management, but mainly architectural decision management. It was also the title of this part. As you see, almost all these situations involve architectural decision management, and this is something rather new. We are convinced that the architectural decision has become the cornerstone of an agile architecture practice. We shifted from, as you know from before, this big solution architecture document-centric approach towards a more architecture decision-centric approach. Why is that? Because architectural decisions, they are lean, they fit on a page. They fit also better in a delivery process, because in an agile delivery process, because they are smaller, they can be maintained in a more iterative way. They're also consumable by architects as well as stakeholders. Stakeholders understand very well what decisions are, of course, and they embody rather well the steering and guiding activities of the architect in the change process. But let's go back to the training. Next slide, please. So the stakeholders are trained together with the architects in what we call the bootcamp session. We also have the idea to let the architects in the community take ownership of the situations. So in that case, they could, during the bootcamp sessions, animate the discussion and particularly on the situation they have taken responsibility for. That also increases their leadership capabilities in that matter. But a bootcamp session is not enough. Architects, they solve stakeholder situations by working together. Typically, as architectural decisions will impact multiple domains or expertise areas, and so most of the cases you will involve multiple architects. Therefore, we also need to train the architects in group around the stakeholder situations, developing the leadership within the architectural community. We plan 2 practice days, architect practice days, where the architect solve a couple of situations end-to-end using all the architecture services. Ideally, of course, they should work on the situations that were discussed during the bootcamp. And at the end, we bring the architects and the stakeholders again together in a retro to discuss all the learnings and make an action plan to organize the architectural activities in the tribe. Next slide, please. Now, tribes and teams have been designed typically to be autonomous as possible. They handle journeys end-to-end from requirement to implementation, even to operating the solutions. But there are of course dependencies and constraints, and dependencies between tribes, between different domains, and constraints that are set by policies, by standards, by group targets, and so on. And this is exactly why the architects are needed in an agile era, even more than before, even more than ever. They connect the dots. They make sure that all the dependencies and constraints are taken into consideration. But for that, architects need to have a holistic view on the enterprise. And therefore, you might imagine the architects as constituting some kind of a big distributed brain containing all the shared architecture knowledge. In fact, when I do the trainings, I always say architects are even the conscience of the enterprise, because we can't help but always see the consequences of any change that is proposed. Now, how do you organize such a shared architecture knowledge? How is it structured, all this knowledge? How do you govern the knowledge? What tools are you using to maintain it? Do you use that with Confluence? Do you use that with some sophisticated knowledge management tool? Is it a repository-based architectural modeling tool, or it's a combination of these? And the knowledge is created and maintained most often in a co-creation way. How do you support co-creation? How do you do this collaboration? Do you use smart whiteboards or other collaboration tools? We are currently experimenting with these. So we are really struggling at ING with all this, and I guess you do too. So you see, we are in a long journey. We are far from having conquered fully and mastered fully what we want to do. But the good news is this topic on what I've now sketched, that is the topic for the next breakfast session, which will be in March. This is a bit the message I had. Please, over to Ludo.
Thank you very much, Leo, for your sharing your insight. I think it's extremely valuable. I like as well the fact that questions are asked in the chat box and are being answered by our colleagues, like the question from Michelle answered by Bart. It's very well. As we are on time, we have time for one more question. Is there anybody that would like to unmute and to ask a question to one of the speakers? Unless I think Henrik, he had another meeting. He left the meeting already, but the other ones are still available. So one question.
José Puls from Janssen here. When you start from... Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
When you start from stakeholders' situation and the challenges they face, usually that is not, at least in my experience, not bringing you to the real enterprise level. People look at it from within their area, within their domain, and their area of authority. And I wonder how you achieve the enterprise architecture vision and direction if you only start from the stakeholders situation at departmental level, for example.
Well, multiple answers maybe. Stakeholders are at all levels. We have stakeholders at the CXO level, stakeholders at the senior management level, stakeholders at the departmental level. The situations we are looking at are also, we prepare them also in a certain way, in a sense that we try to make them representative for all the stakeholders in all the situations you might have. And as we told, we want to shift more and more towards leading and planning. We will make sure that we have sufficient situations and stakeholder views that concern exactly the enterprise view and the broader view. Is that an answer?
Yeah, I think I was thinking from a bigger organization, to be honest. I think that if you have an organization with hundreds of VPs, yes. I'm not sure whether that is still feasible.
Well, what we think is that that you will typically we think that you can, and that's what we try to do with. So we have our service catalog that that already tries to classify the type of architectural assignments you can do, and also at the situation side we try to group them and classify them into categories of situations, typical situations, let's say archetypical situations. And we talk up to the level of the management board of ING. Henrik is sitting with the management board of ING. Our chief architects are sitting with the CIOs, all the CXOs of ING. The enterprise architects are sitting with all the tribe leads and the ones that drive the delivery. So we have representatives of architects at all echelons, at all layers of steering and guiding. I do not know if it is a question of scale or is this a question of volume or whatever, but we try to be represented at all levels. And okay, but we can discuss offline if you want, Jan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jos, for the question. Thanks, Leo, for answering. So it already was mentioned. So the next breakfast session is on architectural processes and tools. It will take place in the spring of next year on the breakfast of the March the 5th. Have a good day. Wish you, as we are at the end of the year as well, wish you a very safe and healthy end of the year, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.